Good evening and welcome to the 5th News, a newscast for 5th graders. I am your host, William Castell. Tonight we are honored to have Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. with us.
Thank you for having me, William.
As you know, Dr. King is not alive today. This is a hologram sent in from the scientists of MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Sorry to break it to you, Dr. King.
No worries, William.
So, Dr. King, when were you born?
I was born January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia.
I understand that was a very difficult time for the African Americans in this country. What was your childhood like?
My childhood was pretty normal. I lived in a big house with my mom, my dad, siblings and grandparents. Life was good. But one day, everything changed. I went to play with my white friend across the street and his mom didn't let us play together. The reason was that I was black.
Wow, that must have been very difficult for you. Is that the first time you realized you were a victim of segregation?
Yes, William, it was. I learned that segregation was the way it worked in Georgia and all over the southern United States. I learned that segregation existed because many white people believed that black people didn't deserve to live as well as white people lived.
I understand your dad was a minister. Is that what made you become one, yourself?
Yes, when I was 15, I entered Morehouse College in Atlanta. It was a college only for black men. 4 years later in 1948, I became a minister and began studying at Crozier Theological Seminary. I graduated in 1951 and went on to Boston University.
So, when did you get married to your wife, Coretta Scott?
We were married in 1953. I was 24, and a year later we moved to Alabama because I had taken a job as a minister in Montgomery.
How long did the Montgomery bus boycott last?
It lasted 1 year. In 1956, the Montgomery bus boycott ended because buses were no longer segregated.
So, when did you form the SCLC?
I formed the SCLC of the Southern Christian Leadership Council in 1957, the same year my son Martin Luther III was born.
What was the purpose of the SCLC?
It was to work for civil rights using nonviolent resistance.
Interesting. How was your visit to India?
Well, it was an amazing experience to see where Mahatma Gandhi had worked and the effect of his work. We also learned how Gandhi had gone to jail for breaking laws he thought were unfair. The method of nonviolent resistance brought attention to unfair laws. That's when I decided I wanted to do the same. I would peacefully break unjust laws and go to jail if I had to.
Between 1961 and 1963 a lot happened for you. Can you tell us about it?
Yes. In 1961 my son Dexter was born and in 1963 my daughter Bernice was born. That was the same year I led protests against segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. And I gave my famous I Have a Dream speech in Washington, D.C., which has become really popular. I wish I could have seen the royalties from it.
So, how does it feel knowing you were the youngest person to win the Nobel Peace Prize?
Well, it feels great knowing that I was the youngest person to win the Nobel Peace Prize and for some reason I keep forgetting.
What was your accomplishment in 1965?
Well, I organized voting rights protests in Selma, Alabama. It was difficult and a lot of people were beaten, but that year we gained our right to vote.
What about in 1967?
In 1967, I began to organize a march for poor people.
Sorry to break it to you, but in 1968, you were shot and killed in Memphis, Tennessee by an unknown suspect.
Yes, I was thrown into jail, and yes, I was killed. But I took a stand against segregation by leading nonviolent protests. I took risks, but at the same time, I made history.
I want to thank MIT for providing us with this hologram, and I want to thank you again, Dr. King, for telling your amazing story.
My pleasure.
Well, that's all the time we have. Tune in next time to the 5th News. Good night.